What is going on, Mile High City?
Woo! Baby! Yes! Yes! Cheers. In a game of butt cheeks, old middle school football team could scheme a better offense than Adam Gase. So as you know right now, I am doing my docu-series on the Colorado Avalanche's journey from when it started back in 2011, the assembling of the core that eventually brought the Colorado Avalanche their third Stanley Cup, which they just won this past year. And don't worry, I got episode 4, it's coming out soon, I'm working on it. But this is something that's been on my mind for a while. In fact, it's been on my mind pretty much since, I would say, the start of the playoffs. I've always wondered, what would happen with the Quebec Nordiques, had they never moved, what hockey would have been like had they found a way to make it work in Quebec. And today I figured, why not explore that a little bit more? Let's ask an interesting question. What would have happened if the Quebec Nordiques never moved to Denver? What would have happened to hockey in Quebec? Do they win those Stanley Cups that the Avalanche end up winning? Maybe then what happens to hockey in Colorado? The Avalanche even exists if Quebec never moves? Let's talk about it, shall we? So, to do all of this, we have to set the stage first for what happens. I'm sure if you're watching this, you know the story going in, but for those who just might not know, let's start with a little quick rundown of what happened, just setting the stage again. So, in 95-96, at the start of the 95-96 season, the Quebec Nordiques moved to Colorado to become the Avalanche. Marcel Aubue sold the Nordiques to a sports enterprise franchise in Denver that would establish them as the Avalanche. And then in their first ever year in Denver, the Avalanche won a Stanley Cup, sweeping the Florida Panthers. And understandably, many Quebec fans are still very bitter about this. The idea that, of course, the second the team leaves, they win a cup. And it should be mentioned that at the time that they left, they had a pretty banger team going, and then it got even better once they moved. So, let's go start with, first off, the Quebec Nordiques moving. In general terms, especially if you're talking in Canada, the idea of Quebec City, one of the biggest provinces in Canada, and of course the heart of the province itself, the idea of it not having a professional hockey team seems like sacrilege. The idea that Quebec City would not have professional hockey? It's unfathomable. No one would say that. So, of course, the idea that when a team moves, there's always a few factors that people try to look into, or blame, I guess you could say, for why a team does leave, especially if you're leaving such a huge hockey market like Quebec. The first big thing, attendance. It has to be the attendance, right? Nobody's going to the games, the fans don't care, the people don't care, the city doesn't care. Let's move them somewhere that does. Not entirely true. Now, a lot of this I am basing off of some of my own research, obviously, and the hockey guy a few years ago, if you don't know the hockey guy, he is fantastic, and he did a video on why the Quebec Nordiques actually left. And he showed that attendance was not their biggest issue. They still were packing the house, even though that arena was really old, and that'll be a huge factor later. But Nordique fans were still going to games, they were still buying tickets, they were still going to watch the team, even when the team was bad. And before the Nordiques left, holy crap, were they terrible. Keep in mind, in the 93 season, the Nordiques made deals with the Leafs and made some trades so that the Nordiques would end up pretty much just tanking the last half of the year, and they would get the number 1 overall pick in the 93 draft because the Tom Curvers trade had backfired on the Leafs, and they didn't want to get, and they had given up their first round pick, and they didn't want to give the New Jersey Devils the first overall pick, which would turn into Eric Lindros. Devils still got Scott Niedermayer out of that though, so they got a pretty good deal. But here's the thing, a big reason why this team was still selling tickets, even though they were bad, was a young core was starting to grow and develop. Joe Sakic, he was starting to become a new franchise centerpiece. They had guys like Mike Ricci, Adam Deadmarsh. You had guys like Yui Krupp in there. You had some pretty decent players in this whole thing. Now, It should be noted that, and then in '93, the Eric Lindros trade happens, of course. Pierre Lacroix pull out that huge deal, and that brings them even more amazing players. That brought them Peter Forsberg, who was the 6th overall pick in the same draft as Lindros, and Forsberg and Sakic were a nightmare tandem to deal with. You had Adam Foote on defense. You had a really good team starting to come together. So it's understandable that Quebec fans wanted to see the team grow. They're like, okay, yeah, it sucks now, but with the way these guys are looking, okay, this might be something. They had just hired Mark Crawford, who had a lot of promise as their new head coach, and things were looking good, and then they moved. So, attendance isn't really the issue. Fans were still going. They wanted to see how the team would grow. What about the second reason that people often blame for when a team leaves? Well, I kind of mentioned earlier, it's when a team is bad. Nobody wants to go see a bad team, especially in a huge market like Quebec City. There's so much to do, there's so much to see. The Montreal Canadiens play in the same province as you, and they have an amazing team that had won a Stanley Cup just a few years ago. They still have guys like Patrick Waugh, they have Mike Keane, Mario Tremblay in there. Why would I go bother to see the Nordiques? The team is terrible. Let them leave. They're not any good. And yes, that's true. The Nordiques were not very good before they left. Just look at their records. But it should be noted that, again, like I mentioned, that young core was starting to come together. They had just made the Lindros trade, which means they had a lot of stuff that was going to end up working out and end up coming their way. So, maybe the team being bad did not matter much to the fans, which leads us to the third and final reason that people will always blame as to why a team moves. Another huge reason that people point to as to why a team would move: greedy ownership. Everyone loves to just dunk on greedy owners, and Marcel Aubé was by no means popular. He was hated. And I'm not going to say that it was undeserved either. He wasn't exactly great at investing in the team. He was kind of a cheapskate. He really did the fans dirty when he left. And here's the thing, at the time that they were leaving, he had been asking the province about a brand new stadium, because the stadium they were playing in currently at the time, it was very old, very outdated, and Montreal, obviously they didn't want to be little brother anymore, so they asked for a brand new stadium, and the province said no. Which is a little shocking. You would figure that Quebec would want to do anything they could to keep their team, to keep the Nordiques. And they said no multiple times to Marcel Aubé. They did not want to give him his new stadium. And he really didn't have any political capital because he had kind of burned a lot of bridges. And when Eric Lindros later revealed that Aubé was the main reason he didn't even want to play in Quebec. And of course there was all the questions of, you can't really keep this team together in Quebec City, like this roster isn't sustainable, nothing. Everything was just kind of going wrong for the Nordiques. So understandably, Aubé decided to just put this thing up for sale and get rid of this headache, and a Denver sports enterprise said, hey, we will take care of that for you. It should be noted that at the time, they also owned the Denver Nuggets, and yes, eventually this enterprise would end up being absorbed and turning into Crunky Sports and Entertainment. They would end up being purchased by them, and then they became Crunky Sports and Entertainment, and they now own the Avalanche, the Nuggets, the Rapids, and the Mammoth, and that's just their Colorado teams. Crunky Sports owns a lot. But it is known that at the time they were building a multi-sport complex in the heart of downtown Denver that was meant to be a state-of-the-art arena, and it would eventually become the Pepsi Center, but it wouldn't be ready for a little while. But they told Aubé, if you just spend 2 years at McNichols Arena, eventually we will give you the Pepsi Center, and that now is Ball Arena, and that is a multi-sport complex. It hosts multiple concerts, it hosts the Avs and the Nuggets, and it also hosts the Mammoth of the National Lacrosse League, who also just won their most recent championship too. This seemed like a home run for Aubé. He just kind of wanted this headache gone, so he did it. He sold to Denver, and then he just kind of left, and then the Nordiques moved too. And understandably, Quebec fans were enraged. They were so mad that their team that they cared about was being ripped just as it was all starting to come together. And then you look at some of the moves that were made after they moved. I mean, right before the season started, the Avalanche trade for Claude Lemieux, who was a huge part of that team winning the Cup in '96. They make moves and get guys like Xander Zozelinch. They get him on the back end. Where'd that guy come from? Valeri Kamensky was starting to come into his own. They made the Patrick Waugh trade in December, and I'm actually going to talk about that one trade a little later. It's understandable that Quebec fans were upset, and then, of course, they win the Cup their first year there, and then 5 years later, they win their second Stanley Cup, beating the New Jersey Devils in 7 games. Just 22 and 21 years later, the Avalanche just raised their third Stanley Cup, this time with Joe Sakic not playing for the Avalanche, but managing them and assembling the roster that just won them a championship. Meanwhile, Quebec City, still no hockey team. There's always been talks, there's always rumors, but things haven't really materialized out there. They really haven't. Everyone just keeps saying, hey, just wait till the Coyotes need to move, and the Coyotes, they'll move. They'll move to Quebec City. And that's never happened. It looks like the NHL will keep the Coyotes in the desert until the end of time. And there's been 2 expansion teams recently, neither of them in Quebec City. One in Vegas, one in Seattle. Both of which, well, at least I can say the Vegas one. Seattle will give it a little bit of time, but the Vegas one seems to be a home run success for the NHL. What if the Nordiques did not move? What if the province told Marcel Aubue, okay, we don't want the Nordiques to move. Maybe Aubue hasn't burned every bridge in existence by this point, hadn't had such a sour reputation. Maybe the province, with some political capital help, does say, okay, give us a couple years, and we'll give you your arena, and the Nordiques end up staying. It's an interesting question to ask. And then, of course, it's part of what would have happened to hockey in Colorado, because remember, Denver did have a professional hockey team before. It was in the WHA, and it was the Colorado Rockies. And no, they didn't look like this. No. They looked like this. Not a bad look, though. Not gonna lie, it's a pretty snazzy look, if, by 70s standards. But that team ended up moving to New Jersey, and they became the Devils. So Colorado hadn't had a team in some time. So what would have happened if the Nordiques hadn't moved? Would Denver still get a professional hockey team? And how long would it have taken for them to get one? If they did get one anyway, we'll get toward that later. Let's just focus on the Quebec side first. So let's just start with that. Let's just say in 93-94, the province of Quebec tells Marcel Aubue, okay, fine, we'll give you your stadium. You don't have to move. Give us a couple years to build it. Okay, fine. In that time, they had just made the Lindros deal, which is something that the Nordiques would have had complete control over, and it would have been something that they would have been able to tinker with in their time. Pierre Lacroix was an incredible general manager, and he would have had all of the pieces and the assets of the Lindros trade. And they made some moves. Remember, they traded for Peter Forsberg when they were still the Nordiques, not when they were the Avalanche. The one trade they did make, one of the first trades they made when they were the Avalanche, when they moved to Denver, was trading for Claude Lemieux. Do I think they still make that deal? Probably, yeah. I mean, the Devils are probably a little bit more hesitant to hand him over to an Eastern Conference team, but still, I think they can pull that off. Who knows, maybe they still get Xander Zozelinch. Maybe they still are able to beef up the back end, and Valeri Kamensky still takes those huge steps forward as a sniper on offense. And maybe this Quebec team really does take massive strides. And it would have been interesting because this was an interesting time in the Eastern Conference. Montreal was on the downturn, and again, we'll address them in a bit. Montreal was on the downturn. Wall wasn't happy with them, and the Canadians just weren't as strong as they'd been in the past. They'd gotten a few new expansion teams. They'd gotten the Ottawa Senators, Tampa Bay Lightning, and Florida Panthers. 3 brand new teams introduced into the NHL, though the Senators were kind of a reincarnation. That's a whole complicated thing. The New York Rangers were still kind of riding off the high of their Stanley Cup win, their first ever win in franchise history. The Islanders were kind of in a tailspin where they would get really talented players and then they kind of gave them away before they really did anything with the Islanders. Like, the Isles never really grew and developed the talent that they drafted, which was odd considering how many great players that they ended up getting. Just look at their draft records in the 90s. Though the East was relatively open, and since they would not have been in the West, they would not have had to go through the powerhouse Detroit Red Wings in the Western Conference Final. Which, I mean, yeah, it would have robbed us of what would eventually become the incredible blood feud between the Avs and the Red Wings. But at the same time, it's a little bit easier road because maybe you just have to go through a tough, but maybe less, but a definitely less tough Florida Panthers team instead of having to go through a team with Steve Yzerman, Darren McCarty, Mike Vernon in net. You had Vladimir Konstantinov, you had Kozlov, Sergei Fedorov. You get the point. Oh, let's just say the Nordiques, 95-96, they're still in Quebec, they're in their brand new stadium now. Do the Nordiques win that Stanley Cup that the Avalanche won? Would have been tough to say, because more likely than not, they would have had to play those exact Red Wings in that Stanley Cup final. Now, that would have been pretty entertaining. Granted, it wouldn't have been, full, Avs Red Wings style, but it would have been pretty interesting. Because keep in mind, in this timeline, the Nordiques do still have Claude Lemieux. So maybe he lays that hit on Draper in the final anyway. Maybe he breaks his face anyway and kind of starts a little spark there. But there is one trade, and I wanted to address it. I'm pretty fairly confident that a lot of the trades that were pulled off in the Lindros trade tree, if you've seen that Sportsnet video on it, I'll link it below. I'm fairly confident that the Nordiques still would have made a lot of the trades that were made in the tree anyway, because a lot of the early deals were made when they were the Nordiques, but a lot of the big ones were made when they were the Avalanche. So, of course, I still think they get guys probably like Rob Blake. They maybe still get them through the trade, because I remember they traded Denmarsh in a deal for them. Maybe they still end up acquiring guys like Claude Lemieux, Sean Podine, probably they get him through that. Who knows, maybe they actually do pull off the Ray Bourque trade, because the Bruins were kind of in a downturn when they traded for Ray Bourque. But the big one that I've never been confident in that they could have still pulled off, Patrick Roy. Right, we all know the story. I'm not going to go through the whole, 11-1 game again. But here's the thing. Let's just say you're the Montreal Canadiens, and Patrick Roy has just demanded a trade live on the bench, and you kind of have no choice. You're stuck. He's not going to play for us anymore. And one of the first calls you get is from Quebec. And they'll say, hey, we got Jocelyn Thibault and a couple of pretty good players. We will trade you that for Patrick Roy. Oh, and throw in your captain in there, Mike Keane, just a little extra spice. Now, look, Pierre Lacroix is an incredible general manager, and he's an excellent negotiator. I have no doubt that maybe come hell or high water, he finds a way to pull off this deal, and maybe somehow he convinces the Canadiens to trade them Patrick Roy. It's perfectly possible. I'm going to vote more likely not, though. It's probably more likely than not that Patrick Roy is not traded to Quebec. I mean, just picture yourself in the Canadiens' position. You're already pissed off your premier player, your franchise centerpiece, your all-star goalie, who is undeniably the best goaltender in the league at the time he was traded. Patrick Roy was. And, he'd already won you a cup, he'd already proven himself, and, you're already being asked to trade. And now you would put in a corner where you would willingly give that player to your in-province rival, the team that you hate, the little brother complex. You would willingly give up Patrick Roy and your captain Mike Keane to them? Look, I'm sure that maybe some things just were inevitable no matter what. Maybe it's possible they pull off this trade regardless. But considering how much hatred Montreal has for Quebec, I'd be willing to vote it's more likely not that they don't pull off that deal. So, then there's the question. What if they don't get Patrick Roy? What if they have to just roll with Jocelyn Thibault? Keep in mind, he looks pretty good through the regular season. Playoff stats is obviously the big dividing factor between him and Roy, and that's kind of unfair because Roy in the playoffs was a god in net. But you have Jocelyn Thibault. Let's say maybe he unlocks it. Maybe he grows in the Nordiques coaching system and they end up going to the Cup final, and more likely than not, they play Detroit. As much as that team would have been good, the Detroit Red Wings were hungry for it. And it's more likely than not, obviously, without having Chris Draper having his face plowed into the board in Game 6 of the conference final when they played Colorado, more likely than not, they just kind of get their way through the West Conference, and then they end up going to the Cup final. They probably win it. There's a chance the Nordiques maybe pull it off, Maybe Claude Lemieux lays a hit anyway, and that kind of changes everything. But I'd say it's more likely than not, if you're having the Nordiques in the state that they were in, going up against a more powerhouse Detroit Red Wings team. And it's weird to say that because you would think the rosters are kind of interchangeable between the Nordiques and the Avalanche at the time. Like, you'd think, okay, I'm just taking the roster that the Avalanche had, but I'm putting them in Nordiques jerseys. Except, of course, that one X factor, they don't have Patrick Waugh. And without that, I do think the Red Wings would probably end up beating the Nordiques. It'd be fun, it'd probably be close, but the Red Wings probably win it anyway. So now, does this say that I'm saying that the Nordiques would have never won a cup with the team that they had built? Of course not. They would have to absolutely botch it so badly, horrifically, beyond belief, almost intentionally, with the roster that they were building to not at least win one Stanley Cup. I promise you, they win at least one cup. But things would have been much differently. The Nordiques would have stayed in Quebec this entire time. We're not having the debate every time Arizona has money problems. And probably Quebec snags another championship or two. It's possible. Maybe they... But I do promise Nordiques fans, if, you know, I promise you there are Nordique fans that still exist, this. Had that team stayed between that 5-year span, 96-2001, they would have at least won one Stanley Cup. That roster was too good not to, and if Pierre Lacroix couldn't get Patrick Waugh, I guarantee you we'd think, fine, I'll get somebody else. There's going to be another goaltender who can get us over the top. There'll be someone. So, what would hockey look like today with Quebec? They'd still be there. They probably would be taking a downturn by now. I guarantee they wouldn't have the talent that the current Avalanche have. They'd probably be in a bit of a downturn, but if you got a cup or two out of it, considering how much they love the Nordiques, I think they'd be fine with it. So, that's just my perspective. If the Nordiques had gotten to stay, I think at least within that 5-year span, they get one Stanley Cup. At least one. They'll at least play in the final. I think that does happen, because that team was coming together just at the right time. They were growing, and it was too good not to at least have a good shot at it. But now comes part 2 of our question. What happens to Colorado? So I remember going back to that hockey guy video, the hockey guy did state he believes that the Denver would have gotten an expansion team, and I completely agree with him. Because keep in mind, in the 90s, we had a crazy amount of expansion coming through the NHL. A lot of it was, you know, the expansion in California, because you had, you know, Wayne Gretzky, who had, you know, the huge influence with the Kings, which showed the NHL that hockey in California could be a viable thing. So you had the expansion Mighty Ducks in Anaheim. You had the expansion San Jose Sharks. We would eventually get, again, I mentioned the Lightning and the Senators previously. We got the Florida Panthers in expansion just a little bit prior in the late 80s going into the 90s. We had the North Stars move from Minnesota to Dallas to become just the Dallas Stars. You had the Winnipeg Jets moving to Arizona to become the Coyotes. Like, you had a lot of expansion, especially in the western part of the conference. So I do believe Denver does get an expansion team probably around the same time that Florida got theirs. If not then probably around the same time as, say, maybe Anaheim. But here's the thing. Then would Denver have experienced the immediate success that they did as when the 96 Avs rolled into town? No, definitely not. I mean, few things involved. First off, they don't have Sakic, they don't have Forsberg, they don't have Foote, they don't have Lemieux, they don't have Waugh, they don't have any of those guys that won them the cup. They don't have Crawford at coach. They do not have Pierre Lacroix in the front office unless somehow they poach him. And, as I mentioned, they would not have had all the assets and leverage of the Lindros trade. They would have been run completely from scratch. Now, that said, the expansion was a little bit different in the 90s. We all know what happened with the Vegas expansion draft and how there's a bunch of revisionism about it. How it's like, Vegas was overpowered. You know, they got Marc-Andre Fleury. That changed everything. When again, if you go back and you read the articles, everyone thought Vegas was going to suck, except for the goalies. Marc-Andre Fleury got hurt during that season, and they still won games. We just recently had Seattle's expansion, and we all thought they would be a playoff team based on their expansion, and it kinda didn't work out for them. It went south pretty badly. Ottawa's expansion season was a complete and total flop. They won 10 games the entire year. holy crap. Remember, the Capitals are still the worst expansion team in history. They won 8 games the entire season. Like, that is historically awful, but it's an expansion team, right? The Lightning were a walking joke in the NHL, which is odd to think about today, knowing what the Lightning are now. But yeah, back then the Lightning were kind of a joke until 2004 when they won their first Stanley Cup. The Ducks took a little while to come into their own. I mean, they were based off of a Disney movie, but they did end up winning a cup relatively early on in their history, so that's something. I mean, hey, the Florida Panthers were like, what, second or third year? They go to the Cup final where they got swept by Colorado, but they still made it. So for the Avalanche as an expansion team, it could have gone either way. It would really depend on the coaching that they would have had. If they get good coaching like, say, Anaheim or Florida did, then maybe Colorado does experience some success. Maybe they even get into the playoffs. They probably get knocked out in the first round, but they make a playoff team out of it. That's something. Also, not to mention, or maybe they get coaching like Ottawa's, and it's just a complete and total disaster. And remember, the Avalanche actually won their the first ever major sports championship for the city of Denver. If you watch the Unrivaled documentary, the incredible East 60 documentary on the Avs and Red Wings rivalry, it was mentioned that no Denver sports franchise had won a championship yet. The Avalanche did it first. So this means that if this happens, the Avs probably don't win that first ever Stanley Cup, and the Denver Broncos would have been the first team to claim it, as they, just a couple years later, would finally lift up Lombardi. But then what happens to the Avalanche going forward? Because a lot of their history kind of rides on those first 5 years. Well, then there really would have been kind of mired in mediocrity. They probably don't make their first real taste of success until that 2009 legendary draft where they got Matt Duchene, Ryan O'Reilly, and Tyson Barrie all in the same draft. And just a few years prior, they had drafted Paul Stastny. So, they had that core starting to grow. So it's possible that that's like the first kind of taste of success for the Avalanche. But then, let's just say for the sake, of course you could have the big argument like, okay, well if the Avalanche if the Nordiques never moved and became the Avs, maybe Joe Sakic takes over for Quebec instead of Colorado. Maybe Joe Sakic decides, I'll be the GM of the Nordiques, not the Avalanche. But that's like a whole new rabbit hole we could go down later. For now, let's just focus on what we do know. Let's say history kind of stays somewhat the same once we reach the early to mid 2000s. Sakic eventually does get hired as GM, and everything else is the same. They get McKinnon, Landeskog, Rantanen, Makar, and they assemble it. That would mean that there's a good chance that this Stanley Cup that the Avalanche just won would be the first Stanley Cup in the history of the franchise, and it'd be the first ever cup run in the history of the Colorado Avalanche. Keep in mind, the Avs are 3 for 3 in the Cup final. Oh, that means that this 2022 Stanley Cup run would have just an extra little hint of magic thrown in there. First off, this run was amazing already. The Avs lost 4 games in the playoffs, and they dominated their way to the Cup. But if that's like their first ever Stanley Cup run, oh man. Not to mention McKinnon and Landeskog, Rantanen, Makar, those guys are all legends already. Their legend would grow even more. Because here's the thing, I know Denver is primarily known as a football town. We care about our other teams, and Denver is a good hockey market. So the idea that the Avs winning that first Stanley Cup and that being that first real core to appeal to those big fans would have meant massive differences. So, now that we've answered all our questions, what would have happened if the Quebec Nordiques had never moved? I think it's a chance that Quebec does win a Stanley Cup within the 5-year span that the Avalanche won the 2 when they moved. There's a chance, maybe, yes. But I do think the Avalanche do get an expansion team, and eventually they would get their cup, but it would be brought to them not by Sakic, but by Nathan McKinnon on the ice. Sakic would have been in the office. So that's just my opinion on what would have happened if the Nordiques had never moved. I think the Nordiques do get a decent shot at the cup. I think it'd be differently because I don't know if they pull off that Waugh deal. But that said, I think it's a pretty interesting thing to ask. And maybe one day Quebec City will finally get their hockey team back. I think they will. I think they should. It's kind of a crime that we don't have a team in Quebec City. Arizona is a dead experiment, and we're going to see the embarrassment that's going to be Sun Devil Stadium experiment with them. And yet Quebec City can't even get a scratch again? I mean, for God's sakes, Winnipeg, and this is no shots at Winnipeg, Winnipeg is a considerably smaller market compared to Quebec City, and they got their team back. Who knows? Maybe the Nordiques do come back again. Maybe the Nordiques make a triumphant return. But until that day, at least the jerseys you get in the stores are really nice. And the reverse retro was cool. Anyways, that is it for this. Thank you all for coming on this little rabbit hole with me. Hope you all enjoyed it. I will have episode 4 out of my docu-series very soon. Keep your eyes out for that. Anyways, that is it for me. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Be on the lookout for more videos soon. I will see you guys later.